Chapter 1. The Mission Continues. The pre-dawn silence in Sophia Montenegro's cramped studio apartment was broken only by the soft rustle of starched cotton as she smoothed her plain gray uniform. The costume that had become her second skin over these past 6 torturous months. Her reflection in the cracked mirror revealed a masterpiece of deception. Designer bone structure hidden beneath artfully mussed brown hair. Aristocratic posture deliberately slouched into submission, and intelligent amber eyes trained to avoid direct contact. Nevertheless, those same eyes burned with purpose, as fierce as wildfire. "Today," Sophia whispered to the photograph tucked inside her uniform pocket, her father, in happier times, standing proudly before the Montenegro Grand Hotel's golden facade, the empire Alexander Kane had destroyed with surgical precision, leaving her family in ruins and her father broken beyond repair. 6 months of this charade, 6 months of scrubbing floors that had once been polished by others in her honor. 6 months of serving the man who'd stolen everything she'd ever loved. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. Yet beneath the resentment, something more dangerous had begun to bloom: doubt. Moreover, Alexander Kane wasn't the monster she'd expected to find. Sophia's phone buzzed insistently, her uncle's name flashing across the screen with the persistence of a debt collector. She'd been avoiding his calls for 3 days, knowing exactly what pressure awaited on the other end of that connection. "Sophia!" Uncle Ricardo's voice crackled with barely contained fury when she finally answered. "Please tell me you have something useful after all this time." "I'm close," Sophia lied smoothly, her manicured fingers, now deliberately roughened from manual labor, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "There's a board meeting today about future acquisitions. If Kane keeps his pattern, he'll have confidential documents in his private office." "Close isn't good enough," Ricardo snapped. "Your father is dying of grief while that bastard profits from our suffering. We need proof of how he manipulated the acquisition, evidence of the fraud that destroyed us." The guilt twisted in Sophia's chest like a blade, sharper each day as the weeks passed without the damning evidence her family desperately needed. What she'd discovered instead was far more complicated. Alexander's late-night charity donations to displaced hotel workers, his personal intervention when elderly employees couldn't find new positions, his genuine regret during private phone calls he thought no one overheard. "Today will be different," Sophia promised, though the words felt hollow. "I'll find what we need." "You'd better." Ricardo's threat carried the weight of family loyalty and financial desperation. "Because if you don't deliver soon, we'll have to consider more direct approaches to justice." The line went dead, leaving Sophia staring at her reflection with growing unease. Her mission had seemed so clear 6 months ago: infiltrate Kane Industries, gather evidence of Alexander's crimes, and destroy him as thoroughly as he'd destroyed her family. However, as she pinned her name tag, Sophie, to her uniform, Sophia couldn't shake the memory of yesterday's incident. When that awful Mrs. Pemberton had berated her for existing in the same space as proper people, Alexander had appeared like an avenging angel, his voice cold as Arctic wind as he'd defended her dignity with fierce protectiveness. "No one speaks to my staff that way," he'd said, and something in his tone had made Sophia's heart skip dangerously. Furthermore, the way he'd looked at her afterward, not with pity, but with genuine concern, had shaken her more than any cruelty could have. Sophia gathered her cleaning supplies with practiced efficiency, preparing for another day in enemy territory. Today's board meeting would bring powerful people with loose tongues and looser morals. If evidence of Alexander's crimes existed, she would find it. What she couldn't predict was how much more complicated her mission would become when those same powerful people recognized breeding and education beneath her humble disguise. Chapter 2. The Penthouse Protection. The morning sun streamed through Alexander Kane's floor-to-ceiling windows, transforming his penthouse office into a cathedral of golden light and masculine power. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that required constant maintenance provided by the woman who'd been haunting his thoughts with increasing frequency. Sophie moved through his space with unconscious grace that belied her humble position, her every gesture refined in ways that shouldn't have been possible for someone of her supposed background. Alexander found himself watching her reflection in his computer screen, cataloging the elegant way she handled his first edition books, the reverent care she took with his mother's antique vase. Furthermore, there was something about her presence that transformed his sterile office into something approaching warmth. "Mr. Kane," his assistant Marcus announced through the intercom, "the board members are arriving for the 10 o'clock meeting." Alexander's jaw tightened as he recognized the voices filtering through his office doors: Douglas Hartwell's booming laugh, Patricia Sinclair's cutting commentary, and worst of all, Victoria Sterling's honeyed tones. These people represented everything he despised about his own world: entitlement masquerading as achievement, cruelty disguised as sophistication. Nevertheless, they controlled enough shares to make his life complicated if he didn't play their political games. "Sophie," Alexander said quietly, noting how she stiffened slightly at his voice, "you should finish up in here before the meeting begins. Some of my guests can be unpleasant." "I'll work quickly, sir," Sophie replied, her voice carrying that intriguing hint of accent he couldn't quite place. "I won't disturb your meeting." Alexander was about to insist she leave when the office doors burst open with theatrical flair. Victoria Sterling swept in like a force of nature, her designer suit and predatory smile announcing her intention to mark territory. "Alexander, darling," Victoria purred, her calculating gaze immediately cataloging Sophie's presence with obvious disdain. "I see you're still playing benefactor to the less fortunate." "Victoria?" Alexander's voice carried a warning edge, but the damage was already done. Patricia Sinclair followed close behind, her sharp eyes missing nothing as they assessed Sophie with the precision of a jeweler examining a suspicious gem. How refreshing to see such dedication to domestic service. "Tell me, dear, where did you receive your training?" Sophie's spine straightened almost imperceptibly, and Alexander caught the flash of something dangerous in her amber eyes before she carefully lowered her gaze. "I'm self-taught, ma'am." "Fascinating," Patricia continued with venomous sweetness. "Your posture suggests classical training. Ballet, perhaps? Or was it deportment classes at some finishing school?" Alexander felt his protective instincts flare as he recognized the trap being laid. These vultures could smell refinement like blood in the water, and they were circling Sophie with predatory intent. "That's enough," Alexander said coldly, moving to position himself between Sophie and his guests. "Sophie has work to do, and we have business to discuss." "Of course," Victoria's smile sharpened to a blade's edge. "Though I must say, Alexander, your standards for household staff have certainly evolved. This one almost looks like she could have been somebody important once upon a time." The barb hit its mark with surgical precision. Sophie's face went pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her cleaning supplies with sudden urgency. "I'll finish later, Mr. Kane," Sophie said quickly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the sophisticated diction underneath. As Sophie moved toward the door, Alexander caught the way Patricia's eyes lit up with recognition, the expression of someone who'd just solved a particularly interesting puzzle. "Wait!" Patricia called out, her voice dripping with false concern. "You look terribly familiar, dear. Have we met before? Perhaps at some charity function? You have such an aristocratic bearing for a maid." Sophie froze in the doorway, her knuckles white where they gripped her supplies. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched the color drain from her face. "I don't think so, ma'am," Sophie replied carefully, but her voice carried the unmistakable cadence of expensive education. "Are you quite certain?" Patricia pressed, taking a step closer. "Because I never forget a face, especially one with such distinctive breeding." Alexander's blood turned to ice as he realized what was happening. These sharks had caught the scent of something they could use against him, and Sophie, whatever her real story might be, was about to become their prey. "The meeting is starting," Alexander announced with quiet authority, his tone brooking no argument. "Sophie, please continue your work in the guest wing." As Sophie escaped through the door, Alexander caught the grateful look she shot him over her shoulder, a look that confirmed his growing suspicion that there was far more to his mysterious maid than met the eye. Chapter 3. The Literary Connection. The grandfather clock in Alexander's private library chimed 11 times, its melodious notes echoing through the leather-bound silence like a countdown to discovery. Alexander had retreated here after the disastrous board meeting, seeking solace among the volumes that had been his companions through childhood loneliness and adult isolation. What he hadn't expected to find was Sophie, curled in his favorite reading chair like she belonged there, completely absorbed in a worn copy of Crime and Punishment, the original Russian edition. "Most people find Dostoevsky impenetrable in translation," Alexander observed softly, not wanting to startle her. "In the original, it's absolutely devastating." Sophie's head snapped up, her amber eyes wide with the shock of being caught in an intimate transgression. The book tumbled from her hands as she scrambled to stand, her cheeks flushing crimson with embarrassment. "Mr. Kane, I'm so sorry," Sophie stammered, her refined accent slipping dangerously. "I was just dusting the shelves and the book fell open and I couldn't help but—" "Read 3 chapters in fluent Russian?" Alexander finished with gentle amusement, moving closer with the careful grace of someone approaching a skittish thoroughbred. "That's quite an accident." Sophie's face went pale as she realized the magnitude of her exposure. "I should go. I shouldn't be here. Shouldn't be touching your things." "Stop," Alexander commanded softly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had built his empire. "You're not in trouble, Sophie. I'm simply curious." Nevertheless, curiosity was a pale word for the fascination churning in Alexander's chest as he watched her obvious internal struggle. The woman before him was a symphony of contradictions: humble uniform hiding aristocratic bearing, downcast eyes that flashed with unmistakable intelligence, calloused hands that held literary masterpieces with reverent familiarity. Furthermore, she was breathtakingly beautiful when she forgot to hide it. "I studied languages in school," Sophie said carefully, her story clearly rehearsed but her nervousness entirely genuine. "Before circumstances changed." "What circumstances?" Alexander found himself asking, though he had no right to pry into her obvious pain. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, she quickly blinked away, her composure cracking to reveal vulnerability that struck Alexander like a physical blow. "Sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, Mr. Kane. Sometimes the world takes everything you thought was permanent and leaves you with nothing but survival skills." The raw honesty in her admission resonated through Alexander's carefully guarded heart like a tuning fork struck against crystal. He knew that particular brand of loss, the way security could vanish overnight, how quickly privilege could become prison. "I understand," Alexander said quietly, settling into the chair across from hers with deliberate casualness. "More than you might think." Sophie's gaze met his for the first time in 6 months of careful avoidance, and Alexander felt the air between them spark with sudden electricity. Her eyes were extraordinary up close, golden amber flecked with green, framed by lashes so dark they cast shadows on her cheekbones. Moreover, they held depths of intelligence and pain that made his chest tighten with unexpected protectiveness. "You couldn't possibly understand," Sophie whispered, but her tone held hope rather than accusation. "Try me," Alexander challenged gently. "I may live in a penthouse now, but I remember what it feels like to lose everything that mattered. I remember the isolation, the way people look through you when you're no longer useful to them." Something shifted in Sophie's expression, surprise giving way to recognition, wariness softening into tentative trust. "How old were you?" 12, Alexander replied, the admission scraped raw from a place he'd kept locked for decades. "When my parents died in the car crash, I learned that love is a luxury most people can't afford to maintain when it becomes inconvenient." Sophie's hand moved unconsciously toward his before she caught herself, her fingers hovering in the space between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. "I'm sorry," Sophie said, and her sympathy felt genuine in ways Alexander hadn't experienced since childhood. That must have been terrifying. "It was educational," Alexander corrected, though his voice had gone rough around the edges. "It taught me that the only security in this world is what you build for yourself." "And yet you're kind to your staff," Sophie observed, her tone carrying subtle challenge. "You defend people who can't defend themselves. That doesn't sound like someone who's forgotten how to care." Alexander felt his carefully constructed walls trembling under the gentle assault of her perception. When was the last time someone had seen past his reputation to recognize the man underneath? "Maybe I'm just very good at hiding it," Alexander murmured, his gaze locked on hers. "Or maybe," Sophie whispered, leaning forward unconsciously, "you're not as heartless as you pretend to be." The moment stretched between them like spun glass, fragile and precious and dangerous. Alexander found himself drowning in the warmth of her attention, the way she looked at him as if he were worth knowing rather than simply using. Then Sophie seemed to remember herself, reality crashing back like a cold wave. She stood abruptly, clutching the Dostoevsky to her chest like armor. "I should really finish my work," Sophie said, but her voice carried reluctance rather than urgency. "Keep the book," Alexander said impulsively. "I'd like to discuss it with you when you've finished." Sophie's smile transformed her entire face, revealing dimples that made Alexander's breath catch. "I'd like that too, Mr. Kane." As she moved toward the door, Alexander caught himself watching the unconscious grace of her movements, the way she turned back for one last look before disappearing into the hallway. Something had shifted between them tonight, something that made the vast penthouse feel smaller and infinitely more interesting. Chapter 4. The Protective Instinct. The crystal chandelier cast rainbow prisms across Alexander's dining room as his monthly investor dinner reached its most treacherous point, the moment when wine loosened tongues and revealed the ugly truths wealthy people usually kept hidden behind polished facades. Sophie moved through the room like a ghost, refilling glasses and removing plates with the invisible efficiency that had made her perfect for espionage. However, tonight she wasn't invisible enough. "I say, Kane," Harold Pemberton's voice boomed across the table with the confidence of inherited wealth and cultivated cruelty. "This little maid of yours is quite the curiosity. Where did you find such an exotic specimen?" Alexander's fork stilled halfway to his mouth as he caught the predatory gleam in Pemberton's bloodshot eyes. The man had been drinking steadily since arrival, his inhibitions dissolving along with his pretense of civility. "My household staff are hired based on competence, not entertainment value," Alexander replied coldly, his voice carrying warning that Pemberton was too intoxicated to heed. "Oh, but surely you've noticed," Patricia Sinclair interjected with venomous sweetness, her sharp gaze tracking Sophie's movements like a hawk watching prey. The way she holds herself, the careful pronunciation, that unmistakable air of breeding badly disguised. It's fascinating, really, watching fallen aristocracy pretend to be common. Sophie's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but she continued her duties with admirable composure. Alexander felt his protective instincts surge as he recognized the deliberate cruelty of the attack. Furthermore, he was beginning to understand that Patricia's suspicions might be dangerously accurate. "Fallen aristocracy?" Douglas Hartwell laughed with genuine amusement. "Patricia, you're imagining things. Pretty little maids don't fall from grace. They're born to service." "Are they indeed?" Pemberton's words slurred slightly as he reached out to grab Sophie's wrist as she passed his chair. "Tell me, sweetheart, what's your story? What reduced a girl with your obvious advantages to scrubbing floors for better men?" Sophie went rigid under his touch, her face draining of color as memories Alexander couldn't fathom flickered across her features. The sight of her distress hit Alexander like a physical blow, rage building in his chest with volcanic intensity. "Remove your hand," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of lethal calm that had made grown executives weep in boardrooms. "Come now, Kane," Pemberton chuckled, tightening his grip on Sophie's delicate wrist. "Surely you don't object to a little friendly interest in your domestic arrangements. I'm simply curious about her qualifications." "Mr. Pemberton, please," Sophie said carefully, her voice steady despite the fear Alexander could see building in her amber eyes. "I need to continue serving." "Oh, but you're already serving." Pemberton's laugh turned ugly, his meaning unmistakably crude. "The question is, how many different ways you're willing to—" Alexander's chair scraped against marble as he rose with predatory grace, every line of his body radiating dangerous intent. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as his gray eyes fixed on Pemberton with laser focus. "Release her. Now." The deadly quiet of Alexander's command cut through the dinner conversation like a blade, silencing every other voice at the table. Pemberton's drunken confidence faltered as he finally recognized the volcanic rage barely contained beneath Alexander's civilized surface. "I was just having a bit of fun," Pemberton mumbled, releasing Sophie's wrist with obvious reluctance. "Your idea of fun is my definition of assault," Alexander replied with Arctic precision, moving to position himself between Sophie and his guests. "You will apologize to Miss Sophie immediately, and then you will leave my home." "Alexander, really?" Victoria Sterling attempted to smooth over the tension with practiced diplomacy. "Harold's had a bit too much wine. Surely we can I overlook nothing when it comes to the safety and dignity of people under my protection." Alexander cut her off with steel in his voice. "Sophie works for me, which means she deserves the same respect you'd show any other member of my organization." Patricia Sinclair's eyes gleamed with malicious delight as she recognized the deeper implications of Alexander's fierce defense. My, Kane. Such passionate protection for mere household staff. One might think she means something special to you. Alexander's jaw tightened as he realized the trap closing around them both. Any denial would sound weak. Any confirmation would put Sophie in danger from people who'd use her as leverage against him. Nevertheless, as he looked down at Sophie's grateful expression, Alexander found he didn't care about the political implications. "Miss Sophie has shown more grace and dignity in the past 5 minutes than the rest of you have managed all evening," Alexander said with quiet conviction. "If that makes her special, then yes, she's worth 10 of any of you." The admission hung in the crystalline air like a declaration of war. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Alexander with an expression that made his chest tighten with emotions he'd thought long dead. "Harold, I believe you have an apology to deliver," Alexander continued with implacable authority. Pemberton mumbled something that might have been an apology before gathering his dignity and heading for the door. The other guests followed with obvious reluctance, their evening's entertainment ruined by Alexander's inconvenient ethics. As the dining room emptied, Alexander turned to find Sophie watching him with wonder and something deeper, something that made his pulse quicken with dangerous possibility. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Alexander replied with absolute certainty. "I did." The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity as unspoken truths hung in the air like promises neither was quite ready to voice. Chapter 5. The Vulnerability Sharing. The city glittered below Alexander's penthouse terrace like scattered diamonds on black velvet, but the real beauty stood beside him at the railing, Sophie, transformed by moonlight into something ethereal and breathtaking. 3 hours had passed since his disastrous dinner party. 3 hours of electric tension as they'd cleaned up the aftermath together in companionable silence. Now, with walls of pretense crumbling between them, Alexander found himself in uncharted territory. "You didn't have to help with the dishes," Alexander said softly, his voice carrying over the whisper of night wind through his rooftop garden. "That wasn't part of your duties." Sophie's laugh held notes of something precious and fragile. After you defended my honor like some medieval knight? It was the least I could do. The comparison sent warmth flooding through Alexander's chest, though he tried to maintain his characteristic composure. I hardly think standing up to Harold Pemberton qualifies as knightly behavior. The man's a drunken fool with delusions of relevance. Nevertheless, Sophie turned to face him fully, moonlight catching the amber flecks in her extraordinary eyes. What you did was brave and kind, and completely unnecessary for someone of your position. My position, Alexander repeated with bitter amusement. You mean the position that makes people like Pemberton think they can treat you like property? Sophie's expression grew thoughtful as she studied his profile against the city lights. Is that what happened to you? When your parents died, did people treat you like property? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd spent decades burying beneath layers of success and emotional armor. For a moment, he considered deflecting with his usual corporate smoothness. Instead, something about Sophie's genuine concern made him choose honesty. My uncle inherited guardianship, Alexander said quietly, his hands gripping the terrace railing with white-knuckled intensity. Richard Kane saw me as an investment opportunity, free labor for his failing construction company, a trust fund to raid when I came of age. Sophie's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet night. Alexander, that's horrible. It was educational, Alexander corrected, though his voice had gone rough around the edges. I learned early that love is a transaction, kindness is weakness, and the only security comes from being too powerful for anyone to hurt you. Is that why you became so successful? Sophie asked gently. To make sure no one could ever control you again? Alexander felt his carefully constructed walls trembling under the gentle assault of her understanding. When was the last time someone had asked about his motivations rather than his methods? Power is the only protection, Alexander replied, but the words felt hollow in the face of her compassion. When you're strong enough, no one can take what matters to you. And what matters to you now? Sophie's question was barely a whisper, but it resonated through Alexander's guarded heart like a bell struck in a cathedral. The honest answer terrified him. Increasingly, what mattered most was the woman standing beside him, looking at him as if he were worth knowing rather than simply using. I thought I knew, Alexander admitted, his gaze finding hers in the moonlight. Until recently, I would have said my company, my reputation, my carefully controlled existence. But lately, Sophie prompted when his words trailed off into dangerous territory. Lately, I find myself wondering what it would feel like to matter to someone for reasons that have nothing to do with what I can provide, Alexander confessed, the vulnerability in his admission making his voice barely audible. Sophie moved closer, her presence warming the space between them like candlelight in darkness. You matter to me, she said with quiet conviction. Not because of your penthouse or your power or your protection. You matter because you see people's dignity when the world tells you to ignore it, because you choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. Alexander's breath caught as he realized she was describing the man he'd forgotten he could be, the boy who'd once believed in goodness before the world taught him that survival required callousness. You don't know me, Alexander said desperately, even as he found himself leaning toward her warmth. You don't know the things I've done, the companies I've destroyed, the people I've hurt to build this empire. I know you've never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it, Sophie replied with startling certainty. I know you donate anonymously to displaced workers. I know you personally called every elderly employee from the Henderson Group to make sure they found new positions after the acquisition. Alexander went very still. How could you possibly know that? Sophie's eyes widened as she realized her mistake, color draining from her face as the implications of her knowledge became clear. I overheard phone calls, saw documents. No, Alexander said quietly, his brilliant mind already connecting dots she'd accidentally revealed. That information wasn't accessible to household staff. Those were private conversations, confidential files. Panic flickered across Sophie's beautiful features as she recognized the trap she'd walked into through her own compassion. "Alexander, I can explain." "Who are you?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying hurt alongside suspicion. "And what are you really doing in my home?" The question hung between them like a sword poised to fall, threatening to destroy the fragile connection they'd built with such careful tenderness. Sophie's hands trembled as she gripped the railing, her internal struggle visible in every line of her face. "I'm someone who's been lying to you," Sophie whispered, tears glittering on her lashes like captured starlight. "Someone who came here with agenda and found something she never expected." "Which is?" Sophie's answer came out broken and beautiful. "Love, Alexander. I found love." Chapter 6. The Falling Hearts. Alexander's home office had become a sanctuary of intimate domesticity as dawn painted the city in shades of rose and gold. Sophie sat curled in the leather chair beside his desk, her uniform replaced by one of his cashmere sweaters that dwarfed her delicate frame, making her look younger and infinitely more precious. The revelation of her mysterious knowledge had created a chasm between them, but neither seemed capable of crossing the room to their separate spaces. Instead, they'd spent the pre-dawn hours in careful conversation, dancing around truths too dangerous to voice. "Tell me about the Montenegro acquisition," Sophie said quietly, her amber eyes fixed on the financial reports scattered across Alexander's desk. Alexander's hand stilled on his keyboard as the name hit him like a physical blow. The Montenegro deal had been one of his most successful hostile takeovers, but also one of his most personally devastating, not for any business reasons, but because of what he'd discovered about the family behind the empire. "Why do you want to know about Montenegro?" Alexander asked carefully, his brilliant mind already cataloging the implications of her interest. Sophie's composure cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerability she'd been hiding beneath layers of careful deception. "Because I think you're not the monster people believe you to be. And I think that acquisition might prove it." The hope in her voice undid something fundamental in Alexander's chest. Here was someone asking him to defend his actions rather than condemn them, someone who believed in his goodness despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "Montenegro Hotels was dying," Alexander said finally, his voice rough with old pain. "Family mismanagement, gambling debts, criminal associates demanding payment through legitimate business channels. The patriarch, Eduardo Montenegro, was a good man trapped in an impossible situation." Sophie's breathing hitched almost imperceptibly, but Alexander was too lost in his memories to notice. "I offered to buy them out quietly, keep the family name, maintain their management positions. Eduardo was ready to accept until someone convinced him I was the enemy rather than his salvation." "What happened?" Sophie whispered, though her tone suggested she already knew. "The family chose pride over pragmatism," Alexander continued, his fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the desk surface. "They refused my offer and tried to fight the acquisition through legal channels. By the time the court sided with me, Montenegro Hotels had hemorrhaged so much value that I couldn't save what was left." Sophie's eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. "The family. What happened to them?" "Scattered to the winds," Alexander replied with genuine regret. "Eduardo died of a heart attack during the final proceedings. His daughter disappeared completely. Some say she fled the country in shame. The rest of the family blamed me for destroying their legacy instead of recognizing I'd tried to preserve it." Alexander's confession hung in the air like absolution requested, but not yet granted. Sophie sat frozen in her chair, her internal struggle visible in every line of her beautiful face. "You tried to help them," Sophie said carefully, as if testing the words against some internal truth. "I tried to save what could be saved," Alexander corrected. "Sometimes mercy looks like cruelty from the outside." Sophie rose abruptly from her chair, pacing to the windows with agitated grace that reminded Alexander of a caged thoroughbred. And if the family had known your real intentions, if they had understood you were offering salvation instead of destruction, then everything would have been different, Alexander said simply. But pride and perception are often stronger than truth. Sophie turned back to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks with heartbreaking beauty. Alexander, what if I told you that some truths are too complicated for simple explanations? What if I told you that sometimes people make choices based on incomplete information, and by the time they understand their mistakes, it's too late to undo the damage? Alexander felt his heart stop as recognition dawned like sunrise after the darkest night. The refined bearing, the unconscious aristocracy, the intimate knowledge of his business practices, pieces of an impossible puzzle finally clicking into place. Sophie, Alexander breathed, rising slowly from his chair as understanding crashed over him in waves. My name, Sophie whispered through her tears, is Sophia Montenegro, and I came here to destroy you for murdering my father. The confession hit Alexander like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him reeling with the magnitude of her deception. 6 months of lies, 6 months of manipulation, 6 months of falling in love with a woman who'd been plotting his destruction from the moment she'd entered his life. Nevertheless, as he looked into her tear-filled eyes, Alexander saw something that gave him hope. The same devastating love he felt reflected back at him, complicated by guilt, but no less genuine for its fractured origins. Sophia Montenegro. Alexander said her real name like a prayer, tasting the aristocratic syllables on his tongue. The missing heiress. The woman who was supposed to hate you. Sophia corrected with heartbreaking honesty. The woman who was supposed to find evidence of your crimes and use it to destroy everything you've built. And instead, Sophia's answer came out broken and beautiful. Instead, I fell in love with the man who tried to save my family, even though we were too proud and too stupid to let him. The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, fragile, precious, and terrifyingly real. Chapter 7. The Love Confession. Thunder crashed over the city like the sound of breaking hearts as Sophia stood trembling in Alexander's living room, her confession hanging between them like a blade poised to sever everything beautiful they'd built together. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the glittering cityscape into impressionist watercolors that matched the tears streaming down her face. 6 months, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of devastation that comes from having your entire world redefined in a single moment. 6 months of lies, of 6 months of falling in love with you despite every reason I had to hate you, Sophia corrected, her amber eyes blazing with desperate honesty. Alexander, what I told you was true. I came here for revenge, but what happened between us was real. Alexander moved toward her with predatory grace, his gray eyes searching her face for any sign of continued deception. How can I believe anything you say? How can I trust that your feelings aren't just another layer of manipulation? The question hit Sophia like a physical blow, but she forced herself to meet his gaze with unwavering directness. Because I'm telling you the truth now, even though it means losing everything I've ever wanted. Everything you've ever wanted. Alexander's laugh held no humor. You mean your revenge? Your chance to destroy the man who supposedly ruined your family? No. Sophia stepped closer, her voice breaking with the weight of her confession. I mean you, Alexander. Somewhere in these 6 months of pretending to be someone else, I discovered that what I wanted most in the world wasn't revenge. It was the right to love you without secrets between us. Alexander went very still, his brilliant mind processing implications that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Sophia, I know you have every right to hate me, Sophia continued desperately, her hands reaching toward him before falling back to her sides. I know I'm the last person who deserves your forgiveness or your love. But Alexander, please believe me when I say that everything I felt for you was real. Thunder rolled across the sky again, punctuating her words with dramatic emphasis that would have been laughable if the situation weren't so heartbreakingly serious. "The woman in my arms last night," Alexander said slowly, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "The woman who looked at me like I was her entire world. Was that Sophia Montenegro or Sophie the maid?" "Both," Sophia whispered, tears flowing freely now. "The maid was my disguise, but the woman who fell in love with you was completely real. Alexander, you have to understand, I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to care about you, to want your happiness more than my family's satisfaction." Alexander closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same reverent care he'd shown the night before. "Look at me, Sophia. Look at me and tell me you love me." Sophia's breath caught as she found herself drowning in the intensity of his gray eyes, seeing love and pain and desperate hope warring in their depths. "I love you," Sophia said with absolute conviction, her voice steady despite the tears. "I love your kindness that you try to hide behind corporate ruthlessness. I love the way you defend people who can't defend themselves. I love how you read late into the night because books were your only friends as a child. I love you, Alexander Kane. Not your money or your power or your protection, just you." Alexander's control finally shattered. His mouth crashed down on hers with desperate hunger, pouring 6 months of suppressed longing into the connection between their lips. Sophia melted against him, her arms winding around his neck as if she could anchor herself to this moment of honesty and passion. "I love you too," Alexander murmured against her mouth, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, Sophia. I love you beyond reason or logic or self-preservation." The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest in their hearts as they held each other with desperate intensity, both knowing that this moment of perfect understanding might be their last. "What happens now?" Sophia whispered when they finally broke apart, her forehead resting against his. "Now," Alexander said with quiet determination, "we figure out how to build something real from the ashes of all these lies." As he swept her into his arms and carried her toward his bedroom, neither of them noticed the private investigator's report sitting unopened on Alexander's desk, the report that would shatter their fragile happiness before they could protect it. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. Morning sunlight streamed through Alexander's bedroom windows with cruel cheerfulness, illuminating the tangled sheets where he and Sophia had spent the night rebuilding their connection with desperate tenderness. Sophia lay curled against his chest, her dark hair spilling across his shoulder like silk, her breathing deep and peaceful in ways Alexander had never seen during her months of deception. However, the tranquil moment was shattered by the insistent buzzing of Alexander's phone on the nightstand. "Mr. Kane." His private investigator's voice crackled through the speaker with professional efficiency. "I have the report you requested on your household staff. There are some irregularities you need to know about immediately." Alexander's blood turned to ice as Sophia stirred against him, her amber eyes opening with sleepy contentment that made his heart clench with desperate protectiveness. "Not now, Harrison," Alexander said quietly, trying not to wake the woman who'd become his entire world overnight. "Sir, with respect, this can't wait," Harrison continued with urgent insistence. "Your maid Sophie, she's not who you think she is. Her real name is Sophia Elena Montenegro, daughter of Eduardo Montenegro. She's been living under false identity for the past 6 months." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, even though Sophia had already confessed her deception. Hearing it confirmed by outside investigation made the betrayal feel fresh and devastating all over again. Furthermore, Sophia was fully awake now, her face pale with recognition of what was happening. "There's more, sir," Harrison continued relentlessly. "Bank records show payments from Montenegro family accounts to private investigation firms. Phone records indicate regular contact with surviving family members. This appears to be a coordinated infiltration operation." Sophia sat up abruptly, clutching the sheet to her chest as the implications of the investigator's findings crashed over her like a cold wave. Alexander's expression was transforming from sleepy contentment to something harder, more dangerous. Sir, I have documented evidence of her accessing your private files, photographing confidential documents, and transmitting information to outside parties. This is corporate espionage on a massive scale. That's not... Sophia began desperately, but Alexander held up a hand to silence her. Send me everything, Alexander said into the phone, his voice returning to the cold corporate tone she remembered from her first days in his employment. I want every detail of the investigation on my desk within the hour. As Alexander ended the call, silence fell between them like a curtain dropping on the final act of their brief romance. Sophia watched in horror as the man who'd made love to her with such tender passion transformed back into the ruthless CEO who'd built an empire on emotional distance. Alexander, please, Sophia whispered, reaching toward him with trembling hands. Let me explain. Explain what? Alexander's voice was arctic. How you've been stealing my business secrets for 6 months. How you've been reporting my every move to your family. How last night was just another performance in your long-term seduction plan. No! Sophia's denial came out as a broken cry. Last night was real. Everything between us was real. Was it? Alexander rose from the bed with predatory grace, his naked form magnificent and terrifying in the morning light. Because, according to my investigator, you've been photographing confidential documents and transmitting them to Montenegro family accounts for months. Sophia's face crumpled as she realized how damning the evidence must look without context. I did take pictures of documents, she admitted with heartbreaking honesty, but I never sent them anywhere. I couldn't find anything incriminating because there was nothing to find. You're not the monster I thought you were. How convenient. Alexander's smile was sharp enough to cut. And I suppose your family's payments to private investigators were just coincidence? They hired people to help me infiltrate your organization, Sophia said desperately. But Alexander, I swear to you, I haven't given them anything useful. I couldn't destroy you because I fell in love with you. Alexander began dressing with mechanical precision, his movements sharp with suppressed rage and devastating hurt. 6 months, Sophia. 6 months of lies, manipulation, and calculated seduction. Did you laugh about it with your family? Did you celebrate each small victory in your campaign to destroy me? Never, Sophia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Alexander, I know how this looks, but you have to believe me. My feelings for you are real. Real? Alexander's laugh was bitter. You're an heiress playing at being a maid, infiltrating my home, stealing my secrets, and reporting to my enemies. Which part of that was supposed to be real? The cruel accuracy of his assessment hit Sophia like physical blows, but she forced herself to meet his gaze with desperate honesty. The part where I fell in love with you despite every reason not to. The part where I chose you over my family's demands for revenge. The part where I told you the truth, even though I knew it would destroy everything we'd built. The truth? Alexander's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You told me the truth after 6 months of lies. Only after you'd already gotten what you wanted. What I wanted was you, Sophia cried, her composure finally shattering completely. What I wanted was the right to love you without secrets between us. Alexander moved toward the door with finality that made Sophia's heart crack like crystal. What you wanted was to complete your mission of revenge. Congratulations, Sophia. You've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. Alexander, please, I want you out of my home within the hour, Alexander said without turning around. And if I discover you've stolen anything else, if I find any evidence that you've shared confidential information, I'll destroy what's left of your family's reputation so thoroughly that the Montenegro name will become synonymous with fraud and deception. The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving Sophia alone with the wreckage of her heart and the devastating knowledge that she'd destroyed the only love she'd ever known. Outside the windows, the storm clouds were gathering again, as if the sky itself was mourning the death of their impossible romance. Chapter 9. The Family Pressure. The Montenegro family estate sat like a Gothic cathedral of faded grandeur on the outskirts of the city. its stone walls and leaded windows bearing witness to 5 generations of wealth and power that had crumbled to dust in a single devastating year. Sophia stood in the great hall where her father had once entertained presidents and princes, her heart heavy with the weight of failure and loss. Now the space echoed with emptiness and the bitter voices of relatives who'd gathered to demand answers from their failed operative. 6 months! Uncle Ricardo's voice boomed across the marble floors with volcanic fury. 6 months of perfect access to our enemy, and you have nothing to show for it except embarrassment and exposure. Sophia lifted her chin with the unconscious aristocracy that had been bred into her bones, refusing to cower despite the crushing weight of her family's disappointment. I found no evidence of wrongdoing because there was none to find. Alexander Kane tried to save our family business, and we were too proud to let him. Lies. Aunt Catalina hissed from her position near the massive fireplace, her black dress making her look like a crow perched among ruins. You've been seduced by the enemy's wealth and charm. You've forgotten your duty to your father's memory. The accusation hit Sophia like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand firm against the emotional manipulation that had controlled her for so many months. My father died of shame and broken dreams, Sophia said with quiet conviction. But I've learned that his shame was misplaced. Alexander offered us salvation, and we chose destruction instead. Alexander, is it? Ricardo's smile was sharp with malicious satisfaction. How quickly you defend the man who destroyed everything we loved. Tell me, niece, did he seduce you before or after you discovered his supposed innocence? Heat flooded Sophia's cheeks, but she refused to let them reduce her love to something tawdry and calculated. What happened between Alexander and me has nothing to do with my mission or my family obligations. Everything you do reflects on this family, Catalina snapped with the authority of someone who'd never been denied anything she'd wanted. Your father sacrificed his life trying to fight Kane's hostile takeover. The least you can do is honor that sacrifice by completing your mission. My father sacrificed his life, Sophia corrected with growing strength, because he refused to accept help from someone he'd been taught to see as an enemy. I won't make the same mistake. Ricardo moved closer with predatory intent, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper she remembered from childhood punishments. You will make contact with Kane again. You will seduce him into trusting you completely, and then you will find evidence of his corruption and deliver it to us, or you will face the consequences of your betrayal. I can't, Sophia said simply, the words carrying absolute finality. I won't destroy an innocent man to satisfy our need for someone to blame. Innocent? Catalina's laugh was crystalline and cruel. The man is a corporate predator who's destroyed dozens of family businesses. Your romantic delusions don't change his essential nature. My romantic delusions, Sophia repeated with growing fire, opened my eyes to the truth we've been too blind to see. Alexander Kane is not our enemy. He never was. We destroyed ourselves through pride and poor judgment, and we've been looking for someone else to blame ever since. The great hall fell silent, except for the echo of Sophia's defiant words bouncing off ancient stone walls. Her family stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to fury to cold calculation. Finally, Ricardo spoke with the voice of patriarchal authority that had ruled the Montenegro clan for decades. If you will not complete your mission willingly, then perhaps we need to provide additional motivation. What do you mean? Sophia asked, though the sinking feeling in her stomach suggested she already knew. Kane Industries has several pending deals that could be disrupted by the right kind of pressure, Ricardo said with silky menace. Business partners who might reconsider their associations if certain information about Kane's personal life became public knowledge. Sophia's blood ran cold as she recognized the threat implicit in his words. You wouldn't. We would do whatever necessary to protect this family's honor, Catalina added with vicious satisfaction, including exposing Kane's relationship with the Montenegro heiress who infiltrated his home and his bed. That would destroy both of us, Sophia protested desperately. It would destroy Kane, Ricardo corrected with cold precision, which is exactly what we want. You can prevent that destruction by completing your original mission, or you can watch it happen from the sidelines. Sophia felt the walls of obligation and family loyalty closing around her like a prison built from generations of tradition and expectation. These people were offering her a choice between betraying the man she loved or watching him suffer for the crime of caring about her. Furthermore, she realized with crystalline clarity that this had always been their plan: to use her love as a weapon against Alexander, to turn her feelings into the instrument of his destruction. "I need time to think," Sophia said carefully, buying herself space to find a third option that might save them all. "You have 24 hours, Ricardo announced with finality. "After that, we proceed with or without your cooperation." As Sophia left the family estate that had once been her sanctuary, she carried with her the devastating knowledge that her choice was no choice at all: destroy Alexander through betrayal, or watch her family destroy him through exposure, unless she could find the courage to choose a third path that would require sacrificing everything she'd ever known for the chance to save the man she loved. Chapter 10. The Real Truth. Alexander's office felt like a tomb, as he sat surrounded by the damning evidence of Sophia's 6-month deception, each document a fresh betrayal that cut deeper than the last. Bank records, phone logs, surveillance photos, an entire dossier of calculated infiltration that painted the woman he'd loved as a master manipulator who'd played him with devastating skill. Nevertheless, something about the evidence felt wrong, incomplete, like a puzzle with crucial pieces missing. "There's more, Mr. Kane," his private investigator Harrison said from across the desk, his expression grim with the weight of additional revelations. "I've been digging deeper into the Montenegro family's financial situation, and the picture that's emerging is complicated." Alexander looked up from the photographs of Sophia accessing his private files, his heart clenching at the obvious distress visible in her face, even as she'd been betraying him. "Complicated how?" "Eduardo Montenegro's gambling problem was worse than anyone knew," Harrison continued, spreading additional documents across the already cluttered desk. "Sports betting, underground poker games, high-stakes casino debts. The man was hemorrhaging money faster than the hotels could generate it." Alexander felt his chest tighten as pieces of a darker puzzle began falling into place. "How much worse?" $14 million in debt to some very dangerous people," Harrison replied with professional detachment. "People who don't accept bankruptcy as excuse for non-payment. People who offered alternative methods of debt satisfaction." "Such as?" Alexander asked, though his brilliant mind was already connecting dots that painted a picture he didn't want to see. "Money laundering through legitimate hotel operations, using Montenegro properties to hide illegal activities, converting the family business into a front for criminal enterprises." The implications hit Alexander like successive physical blows. Eduardo Montenegro hadn't been a proud patriarch defending his family legacy. He'd been a desperate man trapped between criminal associates and financial ruin, with no way out except destruction. "I offered to buy them out," Alexander said quietly, the memory taking on new significance in light of this information. "I offered to pay off all debts, maintain family management, keep the Montenegro name." "Which would have solved Eduardo's problems and saved his family's reputation," Harrison agreed. "But someone convinced him you were the enemy, rather than his salvation." "Who?" Alexander demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Harrison produced another folder, this one bearing the Montenegro family crest. Eduardo's brother Ricardo and sister-in-law Catalina. They'd been positioning themselves to inherit control of the hotels after Eduardo's death, and your buyout offer threatened their plans. Alexander felt sick as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. "They let Eduardo die believing I was his enemy to protect their own interests. Furthermore," Harrison continued relentlessly, "they've been using Sophia as their instrument of revenge ever since. Bank records show they've been funding her infiltration operation while promising her evidence of your supposed crimes. The betrayal was even worse than Alexander had imagined. Not just Sophia's deception, but her family's willingness to sacrifice her emotional well-being for their need for vengeance against an innocent man. "There's something else," Harrison said carefully. "Sophia's been receiving regular payments from family accounts, but she's never cashed a single check. Every payment has been returned to sender within 24 hours. Alexander's heart stopped. "What?" "6 months of funding for her mission, and she's never accepted a single dollar. Whatever her motivations for staying in your employment, money wasn't one of them." The revelation hit Alexander like lightning, illuminating truths he'd been too hurt and angry to see. Sophia had been trapped between family obligation and growing love, torn between loyalty and truth, forced to choose between revenge and the feelings that had transformed her from the inside out. Moreover, she'd chosen him over money, over family approval, over everything she'd been raised to value. "The document she photographed," Alexander said urgently. "Do we know if she transmitted them anywhere?" Harrison shook his head. "Computer forensics show the images were never sent via email, cloud storage, or any other digital means. They're still stored locally on a device that appears to have been destroyed." Destroyed? 3 days ago, according to metadata, the same day she returned from her last family visit. Alexander felt his world shifting on its axis as understanding crashed over him in waves. Sophia hadn't been playing a long game of seduction and betrayal. She'd been caught between impossible loyalties, torn between family duty and genuine love, ultimately choosing to destroy the evidence rather than use it against him. She'd sacrificed her mission for him, and he'd thrown her out of his life without giving her a chance to explain. "Harrison," Alexander said urgently, rising from his chair with sudden purpose, "I need you to find Sophia Montenegro immediately, and I need you to dig up everything you can find on Ricardo and Catalina Montenegro's current activities." "Sir?" "Because I have a feeling they're not finished with either of us," Alexander replied grimly. "And if they're willing to manipulate their own family member for revenge, they won't hesitate to destroy both of us to get what they want." As Alexander reached for his phone to call Sophia, Harrison's final words stopped him cold. "Mr. Kane, there's something else. Ricardo Montenegro has been meeting with several of your business partners, and Victoria Sterling has been in contact with him extensively over the past week." The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about the Montenegro family's need for revenge. It was about a coordinated attack designed to destroy both Alexander's business empire and his personal happiness, and Sophia was caught in the crossfire of a war she'd never chosen to fight. Chapter 11. The Grand Gesture. The Montenegro family estate had never felt more like a prison as Sophia paced the length of her childhood bedroom, her heart heavy with impossible choices and the weight of decisions that would determine not just her future, but Alexander's as well. 24 hours had passed since Ricardo's ultimatum. 24 hours of sleepless torment as she'd searched for a solution that would save the man she loved without destroying her family. She'd found none. The sound of cars in the circular driveway below drew Sophia to her window, where she watched with growing dread as black sedans deposited men in expensive suits, Ricardo's associates, here for the final meeting where they would decide Alexander's fate with or without her cooperation. Furthermore, she recognized Victoria Sterling's platinum blonde hair as the woman emerged from the lead vehicle, her predatory smile visible even from 3 stories up. "Sophia!" Catalina's voice echoed through the mansion with imperious demand. "Your presence is required in the Great Hall immediately." Sophia squared her shoulders with the unconscious aristocracy that had been bred into her bones, preparing for a battle she couldn't win, but refused to surrender without fighting. As she descended the grand staircase, voices drifted from the Great Hall, Ricardo's authoritative tones, Victoria's honeyed manipulation, and underneath it all, the low murmur of men discussing business that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with calculated destruction. "Ah, Sophia," Ricardo smiled with false warmth as she entered the room. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing your future role in our plans for Mr. Kane. Victoria Sterling turned from her position near the fireplace, her green eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. Hello, dear. I understand you've been playing house with my former fiancé. How quaint. Victoria, Sophia replied with icy composure. I should have known you'd be involved in this. You never could handle the fact that Alexander moved on from your particular brand of toxicity. Victoria's smile sharpened to a blade's edge. Oh, but he hasn't moved on, has he? He's simply transferred his protective instincts to a new project. And when that project is revealed to be a fraud, well, broken hearts make men do such destructive things to themselves. The threat was clear, and Sophia felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the scope of their coordinated attack. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about destroying Alexander so completely that he'd never recover. What do you want? Sophia asked quietly, though she already knew the answer would be impossible to give. Simple, Ricardo replied with corporate efficiency. You will contact Kane, apologize for the misunderstanding, and seduce him into taking you back. Once you've regained his trust, you will plant evidence of his corruption in his private files and tip off federal investigators. And if I refuse? Victoria's laugh was crystalline and cruel. Then we proceed with our alternative plan. Federal prosecutors receive an anonymous tip about Kane Industries' supposed money laundering operations. The media receives leaked information about the CEO's inappropriate relationship with a domestic employee who was actually an industrial spy. His business partners receive carefully edited recordings of private conversations taken out of context. Sophia felt the trap closing around her like the walls of a collapsing building. They'd planned for every contingency, every possible source of resistance. You'll destroy an innocent man to satisfy your need for revenge, Sophia said with quiet disgust. We'll destroy our enemy using whatever weapons are available, Ricardo corrected with cold precision. Your romantic feelings are irrelevant to family honor. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Sophia felt her heart breaking as she realized there was no path forward that didn't end in Alexander's destruction. Unless... I'll do it, Sophia said quietly, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. Victoria's smile widened with triumphant satisfaction. Excellent. We'll expect results within... The Great Hall's massive doors burst open with theatrical force, interrupting Victoria's gloating as Alexander Kane strode into the room like an avenging angel dressed in Armani. His gray eyes blazed with controlled fury as he surveyed the gathered conspirators with the kind of dangerous calm that had built his empire. Gentlemen, ladies, Alexander's voice carried across the marble floors with Arctic precision. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Sophia's heart stopped as she drank in the sight of him, powerful, protective, magnificent in his rage as he positioned himself between her and her family's threats like a shield made of flesh and determination. Kane, Ricardo sputtered, his composure cracking under the force of Alexander's unexpected presence. What are you doing here? Claiming what's mine, Alexander replied simply, his gaze finding Sophia's across the room with an intensity that made her knees weak, and ending this charade once and for all. Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick folder, dropping it onto the antique table with satisfying impact. Complete financial records of Eduardo Montenegro's gambling debts, including names of criminal associates and evidence of money laundering pressure. Also included are bank records showing Ricardo and Catalina's attempts to profit from their brother's death by manipulating his daughter into corporate espionage. The color drained from Ricardo's face as the implications of Alexander's evidence became clear. Furthermore, Alexander continued with devastating calm, recorded conversations between Victoria Sterling and Ricardo Montenegro planning to frame me for federal crimes using falsified evidence and manufactured testimony. Victoria went pale as she realized her carefully constructed plans were crumbling around her. But most importantly, Alexander said, moving toward Sophia with the focused intensity of a man who'd found his salvation, proof that Sophia Montenegro destroyed evidence rather than use it against me, returned family payments rather than profit from deception, and chose love over loyalty to people who'd manipulated her grief for their own purposes. Sophia felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Alexander reached her side, his hands coming up to frame her face with the same reverent care he'd shown in happier times. "I know who you really are, Sophia," Alexander said softly, his words meant for her alone despite their audience. "You're the woman who chose truth over revenge, love over hatred, hope over the comfort of familiar pain. You're the woman I want to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of." "Alexander," Sophia whispered, her heart breaking and mending simultaneously under the force of his forgiveness. "Marry me," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence of the great hall. "Not for protection or convenience or family obligation. Marry me because what we have is worth fighting for, worth choosing over everything else that tries to tear us apart." Sophia's answer came without hesitation. Yes. As Alexander swept her into his arms for a kiss that sealed their future, the Montenegro family conspirators could only watch in defeated silence as their instrument of revenge chose love over loyalty to the past. Outside the estate's windows, storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally began to break apart, allowing golden sunlight to stream through like a promise of better days ahead. Chapter 12. The New Beginning. 1 year later, the grand ballroom of the newly renovated Montenegro Kane Grand Hotel sparkled with the same opulent grandeur that had once made it the crown jewel of the Montenegro Empire, but now it pulsed with renewed life and purpose. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors as wedding guests filled every seat, their faces glowing with the joy that comes from witnessing true love triumph over seemingly impossible obstacles. Sophia stood before the ornate mirror in the bridal suite that had once been her father's private office, her reflection transformed by happiness into something radiant and breathtaking. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of silk and lace that honored both her family's European heritage and her new life as Alexander's partner in every sense of the word. "You look like a princess," Emma whispered from her position as maid of honor, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she adjusted Sophia's cathedral-length veil. "I feel like myself," Sophia replied with profound contentment, her amber eyes sparkling with the kind of peace that comes from finally being known and loved completely. "For the first time in years, I feel like myself." The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of transformation that neither she nor Alexander could have predicted. The federal investigation into Ricardo and Catalina's activities had resulted in criminal charges for conspiracy and attempted fraud, while Victoria Sterling's reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that she'd fled the country in disgrace. Moreover, the most beautiful transformation had been the gradual healing of the Montenegro family name through Alexander's patient reconstruction of their legacy. "Mrs. Montenegro Kane," Marcus announced from the doorway with obvious delight. "Your husband is waiting for you at the altar, and he looks like a man who's found his salvation." Sophia's heart fluttered at the title she was about to claim officially, though she'd been wearing Alexander's ring and his name in her heart for months already. Their engagement had been a time of rebuilding trust and redefining their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty, and every day had only strengthened her certainty that Alexander Kane was her perfect match in every way that mattered. The wedding march began to play as Sophia made her way down the grand staircase toward the ballroom where her future awaited. The guests rose as one, but Sophia only had eyes for the man standing at the altar, Alexander, resplendent in formal black tie, his gray eyes blazing with love and wonder as he watched her approach. Furthermore, standing beside him as best man was Eduardo's portrait, lovingly restored and positioned as a symbol of family reconciliation and healing. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began when Sophia reached Alexander's side. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have overcome deception, betrayal, and family opposition to choose love above all else." Alexander's hands were steady and warm as he took Sophia's, his touch still capable of sending electricity through her nervous system, despite the intimacy they'd built over months of careful courtship. Do you, Alexander Kane, take Sophia Montenegro to be your wife, to love and cherish in prosperity and adversity for as long as you both shall live? I do, Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, filled with people who'd witnessed their journey from enemies to lovers. I promise to love not just the woman you are today, but every version of yourself you've ever been and every dream you have yet to discover. I promise to be your partner in building a legacy worthy of both our family's best traditions. And do you, Sophia Montenegro, take Alexander Kane to be your husband, to love and cherish in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Sophia replied, her voice steady with conviction despite the tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. I promise to love you not for your power or protection, but for your gentle heart that you hide so carefully from the world. I promise to be your equal partner in business and in life, building something beautiful from the ashes of our complicated past. As they exchanged rings, new ones, designed together as symbols of their authentic partnership, Sophia marveled at how far they'd traveled from that first night when she'd infiltrated his penthouse with revenge in her heart. You may kiss your bride, the officiant announced with obvious pleasure. Alexander's kiss was soft, reverent, full of promises for their future and gratitude for their present. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears of pure happiness. The reception that followed was a celebration that merged Alexander's business associates with Sophia's remaining family members and friends, creating a new kind of chosen family built on love rather than obligation. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Sophia felt herself surrounded by acceptance and joy she'd never thought possible. Any regrets? Alexander murmured against her ear as they swayed to music that seemed to wrap around them like a blessing. Only one, Sophia replied with a mischievous smile that made his heart skip. I wish I'd been brave enough to tell you the truth from the beginning so we could have had more time to love each other without secrets. We have forever now, Alexander said, spinning her gracefully as laughter bubbled up from their joined hearts. And I intend to spend every day of that forever proving that some love stories are worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth choosing over everything else that tries to tear them apart. As their chosen family surrounded them with love and support, as camera flashes captured moments of pure joy instead of scandal, as their future stretched ahead bright with possibility, Sophia and Alexander knew they'd found something rare and precious, a love that had survived deception and betrayal to emerge stronger and more beautiful than ever. The disguised heiress had become a devoted wife, the ruthless CEO had become a loving husband, and together they'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely love stories become the most enduring fairy tales.